Hello, I am Judith Pinero, Executive Director of AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Our offices are in New York, and today I am speaking to you from Brooklyn. And as such, I would like to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and we pay respect to their communities past and present. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving focus of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better, which is why we are gathered here today. We are committed to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs, in person or virtually. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Please be mindful as to not place undue emotional burden, trauma, or pressure on our speakers. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, has been posted in the chat feature. During the program, you can type in questions in the Q&A feature at any time, and you can do so anonymously should you choose. Not all questions will be able to be answered, and we will get to what we can, and we'll seek to advance the discussion further as well. I am grateful for our dedicated partner, the Art Fund, and applaud their commitment and dedication to advancing today's conversation in a rapid response effort. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and knowledge in today's Candid and Open Forum, and for all of you joining us today for making space for this conversation as well. Thank you. Sandra?
Thank you. Am I on? Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm sure you've read the bios. Introduction to our fabulous panelists. So I will give a quick mention to Monica, to Sarah Wajid, to Sepake, who's also going to be speaking with us. So I want to just start off with just a quick question really to all of you all. So we know that in the US and in the UK, there's been in all the midst of this, there's been a positive and energizing moment. Do you think there's anybody that's kind of spoke to you on that level? Do you think amongst all of this, has there been anything that's kind of caught you that you think they've put something across in terms of where we are at now in a positive or energizing moment? And just, I suppose, between anything that's resonated with you, particularly from Sarah, I guess this is more to you, from the UK, and Monica from the States.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll pitch in first, if that's okay. Yeah. It's an obvious one, but I think it resonated with me on personal, professional, and just political levels. The moment when the statue of Robert Milligan came down. Obviously, the very significant moment before that was the statue of Colston coming down in Bristol. Was, you know, for I think all of us who have been working on this front for many decades, that was hugely momentous and exciting, uplifting, and joyous. You know, it really was a joyous moment. Colston has been a long-standing campaign, but then closer to home, 2 days after that, the museum that I work at, the Museum of London, there's a statue not owned by the museum, but right outside the front of the Museum of London Docklands, which is a statue celebrating the notorious slave trader Robert Milligan. And again, for decades, that's been a blot on the landscape. And only 2 days after the Colston statue coming down, activists mounted a petition and a campaign, a renewed campaign, to remove that Robert Milligan statue. And the museum that I work for really, you know, I think crucially with the support and the involvement and led by the Black curator Alima Gray of the London Sugar Slavery Gallery, worked with activists and the council and the trust there to get that statue down. Within 48 hours, that statue was down, and that's been decades in the coming. And it wasn't just the fact that it came down, it was the way that it came down and the speed that it came down with, and that it was a response, direct response in response to activists mobilizing. A museum was aligning themselves very publicly with anti-racist activists. So for me, that was a pretty special moment.
Yeah, and I think that was really interesting, as you said, with the Milligan, because that was a direct way, you know, the movements happening from the grassroots up, you know, and it's important, isn't it, that politicians are paying attention to it. We know government's paying attention, and museums are part of that as well. So I think that was interesting seeing, as you said, the difference between Bristol and London as well. And certainly one of them got a baptism, that's for sure. So what about you, Monica? Any sort of interesting insights from you from across the States in this time?
Sure. I'm going to name 3 things that inspired me on a variety of lenses. Number one, I'm located here in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And as many have seen, the mayor of D.C. put forth an edict to have local artists paint Black Lives Matter along with the DC flag, and then next to it, defund the police, right in a prominent part of town leading toward the White House, in response to the harsh actions that the 45th president took against peaceful protesters. I think I love that kind of response, and regardless the politics of the city, it's inspired a number of other ripple reactions in other states and cities, painting it in front of museums and on walkways. I just saw one that was painted in Newark that says "Abolish White Supremacy," and I think that's really powerful. And I'll just say the other 2, of course, there's been many statues coming down. What's been happening in Richmond with that statue has become transformed by projection art and graffiti, and it's almost become its new form of art. And then, of course, the public art murals dedicated to George Floyd, who was ruthlessly murdered by state-sanctioned police, but just honoring him and how he has become a catalyst, and others like him who have sadly passed away, of art, of representation of social justice.
Yeah, wow, I like that. It's like it's the moment now. People are voicing their frustrations. It's coming out in the streets, and it's really interesting to see how museums, and I wouldn't say are responding, but they're part of that as well, you know? They're part of that. Now on my screen, thank you, Monica. I can't see, is Sepake with us? Or have I just got you, Sarah and Monica?
She's there. Yes.
Oh, it's just you, right? Okay, that's right. Then that means we've got more time. Sorry, I couldn't see if Sepake was with us. I can only see.
You can hear me.
She's there.
Oh, you here? Okay, Sepake, hi. Sorry, I can't see you on my screen. Hi. Welcome to our discussion. I wondered if there were insights, things that perhaps you wanted to kind of share, something that you probably thought that, you know, an act maybe of demonstration or something that you felt, you know, in a more positive light. Anything you want to share?
I mean, I think what's been really important is the fact that during this, you know, difficult time, obviously because of COVID, the kind of care that people are taking in voicing in the streets is really important. So the kind of level of care I'm seeing in terms of people making sure there's hand sanitizer, you know, that people are wearing masks. The demonstrations have really galvanized, I think, a number of people across, coming from different backgrounds, different social economic backgrounds. And I think not only the larger demonstrations and protests and conversation, but I also think where I live in South London, I've also noticed that there are smaller demonstrations, smaller conversations that are happening between people who live locally, who live next to each other. And especially sort of seeing, you know, young Black men talking about their experiences publicly and being given a platform to kind of talk about what it might feel like or what their experience of living in London is like. So I think just seeing those conversations happening in different places, in public spaces, and also I think there's a lot of reading and education. That for me has been one of the strongest things that I've noticed is this recognition and realization that our education system hasn't really necessarily served us well in telling the whole story, and a thirst for wanting to read more, to understand more about our collective and shared history.
Yeah, you're right. And you know what you were saying around you know, young men, particularly young Black men, actually now using this time to really, it almost seems, it's sad, but it's the first, it almost seems like it's the first time we've really leaned in and listened to what they were saying, or they feel, you know, moved by everything to be able to speak. So it's great. And again, the collectiveness, I think it's great to see that whole energy coming from our young people as well. They inspire us all. So I'm going to get into the conversation. I know we've got quite a lot to pack in. You know, it's not every day we get to have three, you know, amazing speakers. So I want to try and see how we go with the questions, and then we'll move forward and we'll take some Q&As at the end. So just to set the context a little bit more in terms of our conversation. It's been many years that we know of things like diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility conversations, programs and work to change our cultural community. And this we see through things like the collections, exhibitions, naming of spaces, locations, those represented in public art statues, memorials, staffing, hiring, funding, leadership. Including changes in things like our governance boards here. Now, there are statements committing to change, but without accountability tied to them. So there's all this, the intention for change is there, but there seems to be this lack of real accountability. And this presents, if you like, a non-authentic feel to which many staff groups are saying that the writers are not necessarily living what they wrote. So the decision makers are placing pressures, if you like, on Black, Indigenous peoples of colour to help them fix the problems that leadership just aren't addressing. So based on your experiences, I know some of you've worked across different spaces, different museums, galleries. I wonder how you respond to some of the followings. I'll give you a few prompts, and then we'll go through each of you. So. Is there a reason the past work didn't really resonate? So things you've worked on before, or maybe things that you've seen that you don't really think quite resonated. Will those places in privilege that didn't listen in the past, will they listen now? And more importantly, do you think they'll really take action? Because that's what we need. We've had a lot of, you know, statements lately. How do we not let this moment pass? So maybe thinking about, you know, what can we do so that this doesn't just pass? And then I think I'll leave it there. There's a couple more, but I hope that will give us enough thought to start off with. And just thinking about some of the works from the past. So just thinking about the past, things that you think perhaps didn't quite resonate, thinking about places of privilege. Is the listening really taking place now, and thinking more about the action? We've done a lot of the talking, as you all know. What's the real action that's taking place? And tying in with that, how do we make sure that this moment doesn't pass, that it doesn't just become something that in 6 months, 9 months, we'll all forget about? Yeah, and thinking about that and how we're empowering those voices to really speak out. So who wants to take a lead? So Sarah, can I start with you on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, you know, some of this is a core question really, is how does the momentum that is built right now, and how does the public pressure and the public accountability, how do we embed it, sustain it, and make it a change that sticks in the future once the headlines have moved on to something else, as they inevitably do. And, you know, as you can imagine, I've thought about this a lot. For those of us like yourself and me and other speakers who, you know, live and breathe this stuff 24/7, there are slow and complex, you know, levers of power that we have all been trying to work around and trying to maneuver and massage and change over a long period of time. And what I'm seeing that's giving me hope for some of these changes sticking a little bit harder at the moment is that there's an incredible bedrock. I mean, as you and I know, Sandra, over the last 5 years, Museum Detox, for instance, the collective of people of colour working in the museum sector in the UK, has transformed from what was essentially a kind of social group to something which is now a kind of really quite a kind of political force to be reckoned with. So in that time, a lot of activists have come of age and have been maturing and learning different ways of talking and thinking and tactics. Chief amongst them have been that I've noticed a real shift from people talking in things like staff networks, perhaps of people of colour, but not talking to their union reps. And those union reps not also talking to governors of museums and not talking to policy people. Now I'm seeing that generation of activists are not only talking to each other in a very serious and sustained way, but they are savvy and they understand that actually there are mechanisms, all sorts of mechanisms around power. The maturity that I'm seeing in terms of the activism of understanding how to leverage what's going on in their union, in their museum, for instance. So, you know, some museums have unions that are representing the vast majority of the workforce. That suddenly means, like in an organisation like mine at the Museum of London, where there are chairs of the Black, Asian, Minority Ethnic Staff Network who are also union reps, that is a very interesting development, because those union reps they are representing the whole workforce. So once you start seeing conversations like that, strategic conversations, and you start seeing directors across the sector being held to account in a slightly more public way, I would say, than I have seen before, partly because of obviously the call for public statements. But just last night on the BBC News, you saw the arts correspondent, not on an arts programme, but on the main BBC News at 10, asking the director of the British Museum, Hartwig Fisher, how many Black curators do you have? Yeah. And Hartwig Fisher had to say, of 150 curators, there are no Black curators at the British Museum. Now, that's a question which absolutely should be being asked on the BBC News at 10, but I haven't seen it asked before in mainstream news. And so that starts to give us a clue as to how some of these tactics are not short-term tactics, but, you know, kind of longer-term things that deserve the level of public scrutiny that they are now starting to receive. And it's for those of us who have been working on it to, you know, kind of mobilize, I think, the rest of the sector, the mainstream sector, the white part of the sector, into these discussions in a way that people are making public commitments around things like publishing ethnic pay gaps, for instance, in their organizations, that can then be held to account, not just by like the Black workers within the organizations, but by the public realm.
Yeah, and I think there's some interesting points. I mean, you said, Sarah, you know, you mentioned the union, you mentioned, you know, the galvanizing of voices, because it absolutely is that, you know, we do need to sort of come together as well. But it's great to see, I think, that this movement, particularly from the younger voices who don't necessarily have that fear, they're not afraid to call out. We've seen what happens with the call out culture, where people are being sort of named and shamed, and that has its, you know, that has its uses. It's not the only way, but I think now it's great to see that there does seem to be some genuine listening, and I think what happens next is going to be crucial now. What about you, Monica? If I can come over to you and get your thoughts on this.
Sure. I think to echo what you were saying, Sarah, the fact that there are few to no Black curators here in the US, situations are similar. We're in a year where institutions are kind of touting and virtue signaling that they have their first Black curator, Asian curator, Latinx curator, and it's 2020, and it shouldn't have taken this long, and it shouldn't be more. It shouldn't be just one, right? There should be more. There should be a flood of people, because they are qualified, engaged, interested persons. So I think, just to kind of dial back a second, we need to kind of actualize, what does racial equity look like? And for me, racial equity is resourcing the change, right? So the changes that are needed for racial equity to be enacted, we have to shift mindsets, we have to restructure organizations, we have to commit funds, institutional funds, grant funds. Money is needed for much of this to happen. We have to make sure there's a long-term transformation, not just a 3-hour training or a 2-session training, but over time, showing people how to be anti-racist, not just to talk about diversity, which is really just representation, but the equity and the inclusion and dismantling and decolonizing our thinking. And so if racial equity encompasses all that, oftentimes these efforts have failed because money hasn't been put towards them in a sustained way. It hasn't become a line item. It hasn't become an essential core part of practice. It's seen as an add-on or an afterthought when it comes to an ethnic heritage month and everyone wants to celebrate, you know, whoever they can find for touting in front of the grant makers. That is when the urgency comes. But now that society is holding institutions accountable, actively calling people out, which I agree does have its place, and saying, you know what, if you aren't about equity and progress and anti-racism, we're not going to support you. Now the urgency is felt. So I would hope that museums, galleries, arts, culture, history, science spaces, and institutions are going to make this part of their core practice and realize that this has to continue and that we can't just do it for 1 month or do it for one person, but it has to take a holistic shift.
Mm. And that's an interesting point. Thank you, Monica. You know, that holistic shift. You spoke about, you know, racial equity, the resourcing for change, investment. I wonder, you're not in a museum, Sepake, but I wondered what your views are on this and how is it in the particular area where you work?
So Iniva's work is, I guess, related directly to museums in terms of the projects that we work on and work in partnership with. So we're currently working on a Future Collect project. So this is, I'm just sort of thinking about this question of how do we move from a statement to action, which I think essentially you're sort of addressing the fact that we have had diversity and inclusion programs. So what's been the effect of that in our institutions? So as I mentioned, Iniva is currently working with Manchester Art Gallery and actually has been working over the last 3 years with Barbican Art Gallery to sort of think about not only the sort of programming, but really thinking about the institutional culture through training and providing opportunities and providing curatorial training opportunities. And I think next step, I think, for us is not just about the kind of curatorial training opportunities, but thinking about more sustained routes into the organizations that we're talking about here, because I think there have been a number of programs that have been set up over the years, and it seems as though, for whatever reason, that hasn't created that kind of seismic shift that we want to be able to see in our museums, that kind of reflect not only the kind of culture of one particular group of society, but that reflects a more holistic whole, right? So I think an element for me that's really significant in this notion of, you know, the statementing is working out how do institutions, museums, organizations listen. What does that look like? How do you listen to your public? How do you listen to the demands that are being made? And then how do you include people in that conversation as to how the action and the change can happen within your institutions? I think a lot has been already said about restructuring, not only in terms of creating space and making space, but also in terms of resourcing. And that's fundamental. And I think that, you know, part of this conversation is not only about how the culture of those institutions, but obviously how they're funded. And often I think that, you know, the kind of policy change that we often see within institutions is related very much to how they're funded. And that conversation, I think, needs to be, we need to sort of think about how it can be more sustained, because when the funders move on to some, you know, to prioritize something else, does that then again change the culture of institutions? And how do then the lessons that have been learned through the development of programs, how does that shape, how does that form the kind of the DNA of that institution? How does it become so embedded and entrenched that it doesn't, you know, necessarily just, you know, shift the moment when that funding has dried up?
And that's really important you raised there, because sometimes what we've all, well, certainly from our side, we see that, you know, the project or the exhibition happens, it's all great, it gets the publicity, it gets people talking, and then, you know, after that, then what happens? You know, and again, that, you know, that long-term thinking, but that comes again, as I think what you were saying, Monica, it's back to that investment, it's back to that core investment. And perhaps institutions thinking differently than relying solely on public funding, but thinking more internally, what are the core, you know, what are they going to fund internally so that we get the sustainability. Sorry, Sarah, you were going to say something.
Sorry, I'm too excited about what Sepake was saying. I just wanted to sort of pick up from your point about funders and sort of long-term and sustainable change. I think, Monica, you also really talked about sustaining and resourcing change and the change makers. I think these are really crucial questions. And alongside this, I think systemically, when I look at the sort of museum and art world gallery sector, the way that it's funded, what I see missing are two sort of pillars, if you want, of regulation. One, I don't really see a regulatory body that is sort of independent somehow. There is obviously funders, Arts Council, NLHF, etc. in the UK, but I don't see a separate, you know, if you look at some other sectors, there'll be like Ofcom, or there will be like a separate regulator. And there isn't really that tension, that healthy, useful tension that we need between a regulator who's keeping us on track and kind of holding our feet to the fire, and the funder. It's all kind of collapsed into one. So you just get this slightly kind of toothless gentleman's agreement kind of culture that's kind of fostered within the sector, because we kind of fund ourselves, we pick our own trustees, and then the funders pick the trustees, or the government does, and maybe actually the organization picks its own trustees sometimes. And so, like, where do you interrupt that flow? Where is the healthy kind of room for regulation? And the other pillar that I see missing is really the kind of consumer, like, if you want, the consumer, you know, rights organization, where something like broadcasting has something like the voice of the listener and the viewer. Where is that organization that represents audiences, not only Black audiences or ethnic minority audiences, but audiences in general? Like, the audience is kind of missing in this debate in terms of like structurally and systemically. And I think this would be a really interesting moment for those organizations like that already exist, you know, like maybe Vocalize in the UK, or Kids in Museums, that sort of that are probably the incipient organizations that do best at representing the needs of families, or you know, people with particular needs in relation to museums. That actually, isn't this a time when we should be fostering a new type of institution that holds us to account? And I think it's as much our job within the sector as it is, you know, for people outside. I mean, look where the actual change has happened. It hasn't, Colston coming down and, you know, Robert, you know, Milligan coming down. Those were acts that came from kind of public will. You know, that was direct action. So I think that tells us a lot about, you know, when the museums are left to its own resources, those statues, they stay there for decades. When public action is, you know, ignited, shit happens.
Absolutely, it does. Monica, I wondered if there, what Sarah mentioned though, in terms of this idea, we touched on it earlier around accountability, and perhaps there being these independent bodies that really hold the institutions to account. Are there any models like that in that exist in the States?
I'm not sure there are. I'm not sure that there are independent bodies. I mean, there's the NEA, NEH, IMLS, and those are government agencies, but I think who really holds museums accountable is the people. And to that point, I'd like to pivot a little bit into talking about demands. I'm not sure about in the UK, but here in the US, there have been numbers of museum workers, arts workers, collectives, labor movements that have been putting forth websites and resource-rich content and hashtags, and putting lists of demands specifically to certain institutions and regional institutions. And as you know, Frederick Douglass, I believe I'm quoting him correctly, said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And so I want to take a little moment to shine a light on some of the demands that are being asked, because again, I don't think we can look for an outside body to save us. I think we have to become that change we want to see, and that as individuals, as collectives, we can form ourselves and make our demands known. And let me also just say that many demands are making museum directors and boards and other leaders scared. They're nervous. How dare the public question them? How dare the public try to share authority or want equity or want parity? They can't believe it. They're incredulous. But this is a moment for us to lean into that discomfort, to be brave, and to realize that demands are rooted in love and accountability, and that the people that love working in museums and love going to museums have a right to demand a certain level of equity and equality from their museums. And so the demands I'm going to share, in no way have I authored, but I'm signal boosting in solidarity with museum workers, and I'm going to just try to sum up.
Yeah, let's hear them.
So for the Culture 2020 is a list of demands from New York City, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, museum workers, a few that they have asked for. Stop all forms of performative allyship and virtue signaling now. Remove all past social media posts that illustrate this performative allyship, basically this kind of false solidarity, doing it for the cameras, doing it for the gram, but not doing it in real life. They've also demanded to create a development pipeline that seeks diverse patrons to grow into members and eventually donors. And some of these demands overlap, so I didn't include them all. From a group called Dismantle NOMA, the New Orleans Museum of Art, they have demanded the hiring of more Black curators and to hire and retain a cohort of BIPOC board of trustees and leadership positions in the staff. They want a complete independent investigation of the origins and the history of ownership, the provenance of all the African and Indigenous items in the collection. And they want this investigation to be in tandem with independent BIPOC curators and the Dismantle NOMA representatives. They want equitable redistribution of departmental budgets. So some departments get all the money, some departments have to scratch and scrape. That power shift needs to change. And they want to make sure that the institution is implementing anti-racism as part of their mission, and the structural changes that will come out of that will be held accountable through policy, procedure, and budgets. And lastly, there is a group out of Southern California, BIPOC for SoCal Museums, and they have 20 demands, many, I'm not going to do all 20, but they would like to see adopting preferential hiring of BIPOC arts workers for all openings, including decision-making and executive roles, chief curators, and using members of the local community who have been historically excluded for this preferential hiring. They would like to see arts funders cease to accept diversity, equity, inclusion statements that focus on what the institution will do, but instead evaluate what organizations have done, what they are doing, and not fund anyone who hasn't walked their talk. Appointing executive directors and senior staff to kind of work in a diversity, equity, inclusion role along with their executive role, and maybe that's a separate person. Ending exploitative labor practices, ending the facade of inclusion and tokenism. The list goes on. So I would encourage everyone to look into these organizations making lists of demands and look to them for how they can hold accountable our institutions.
I think that's quite a list. I think there's certainly some learning from that. It'd be interesting to see how things develop with that, because those are some serious demands on there. And some of that, I think, touches on what you were saying, Sarah, around when people just galvanize and come together, and it's that demanding for change. You maybe just think around that when you were talking, Monica, around, you know, the quote, the Audre Lorde quote, I'm sure you'll know it, where she talks about the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And I suppose coming back to that change where we talk about this on the individual level, the I. So what am I going to do? And how am I going to make that change? And I wondered what your thoughts were on how do we empower. Sarah, you touched on some of this, what you were saying with detox. There are lots of other networks out there. And we're seeing this emergence now of networks that are coming up now, talking about this change. But how do we empower our voices to stand up and speak out? And what do we see as perhaps being some of those actionable steps? Monica, you touched on that, but I wonder, Sepake, if you had something to add to that from people more specifically perhaps within the arts world, so networks that are forming, how people are feeling more empowered or emboldened to speak up and to take some of this action in terms of holding institutions to accountability?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just say, first of all, that I think it's really important to recognise the amount of work that various coalitions are doing in making these demands, because they're well thought through. They're not sort of pie in the sky ideas, and I think that in the case where specific institutions have been addressed, I think it's really important for those institutions to respond. So that's just one thing. I just think, because I think that there's a concerted effort in that grassroots work that is almost a gift for a lot of those institutions, because it's actually sort of that work is being done. So I think that has to be recognised not only as a demand but as forms of labour. And I think in relation to your question, Sandra, I mean, I think that, I think we're all kind of looking for these actionable steps, right? 1, 2, 3, this is what we need to do. Okay, fantastic, we've decolonized the museum, well done. It's not going to be that easy, right? We know that it's not just about decolonizing the museum. I think it's kind of interesting for me in terms of when I'm sort of thinking about, my work and how the work that I do impacts not only in my organisation but across the sector, and with artists and people that we're working with. I often sort of think about the fact that it's how easy it is to also replicate forms of ways of working that are not actually the ways of work that we want to work. So, the fact that I'm an artistic director, it affords me the opportunity to say, okay, if I've got the power to make certain decisions, how can I sort of think about radical sharing of the power position that I might have within my institution? And that radical sharing is a dialogic one. It's a process. It's not just about sort of saying, I'm handing over responsibility. I'm still accountable as the director for the decisions that I make, but I really want to move really to a space of it being dialogic. So, this is something I'm putting out there. What's your response to it? Or I'm listening to what you're saying. This is my response to it. What do you think? And I think that one of the things at Iniva that we've been thinking about very much is, how do we make that conversation between the people that we are, deeming to serve and the work that we're doing a sort of, a shorter route. We don't want that to be a mediated conversation. We want that to be a direct conversation. And I guess some of the issues around that are very much thinking about resourcing and sort of supporting and paying for the labour that's involved in that, right? So, but I think it's so important because that's what makes us relevant as an organisation, and it's a constant call and response. And as I said, sometimes it's a moment to listen, and I think this is definitely a moment to listen in order to respond effectively. And we have to decide how to do that within our own institutions.
Yeah,
Sandra,
definitely a time for listening. Sorry, Monica, go ahead.
I just want to jump back in with some steps that people can take to make change as individuals and, of course, institutional representatives. Number one, when we think of this moment, we're going through a pandemic, hopefully healing from a pandemic very soon. But many people have been laid off, furloughed, people have resigned, concerned about their health. And so there's a great shift and upheaval in employment. And so if you are someone who still has a job, which is amazing, you could be helping others who don't, who are back on the employment trail, thinking of people that have been furloughed and laid off. You could certainly send job descriptions to people that you know are looking, or share them with networks like the one that I lead, Museum Hue, which advocates for people of color in arts culture museums throughout the US. We post job leads on our website, we share them in our groups, we actively court people of color looking to be in this work. Another thing that people could do that's really an act of kindness is offer a LinkedIn recommendation or offer to put in a good word or be a referral for someone who's in the job market. Having quality references is an amazing thing, and it's helpful when you go for jobs. And a lot of times people who are at the margins, who are at the front of the staff, entry level, don't have that. And so if you're a curator or someone who's in the arts or just someone who wants to lend a hand, reviewing cover letters, looking through resumes, looking at portfolios, all of that is helpful. I think that it's also helpful also in the spirit of kind of guiding people in employment is to mentor. If you can kind of put someone under your wing or offer to help someone, be that a high school student, a college student, a career changer, an unemployed person, someone who's a peer, or even someone who's a person who is above you but who's looking to learn, that's a great way to mentor them, to be in a thought partnership with them, and to keep encouraging them. I think that as curators, we have to remix, reimagine, and revise and amend revisionist histories. So if there is a history in the place that you interpret and curate that isn't accurate, that isn't telling the whole story, let's speak truth to life. Let's make sure that we open and expand that. I think it's incumbent upon us as curators to actively showcase political art, protest art, archivist art, making sure that even now we're sharing oral histories and gathering like protest signs and social histories from what's happening in this moment, because this is a watershed moment. There's a lot more I can say. In the interest of time, I'm going to do like a follow-up blog, but I do think there's a lot we can do as individuals, and I have a set of actions for institutions too.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica. I think that's what you made the point, which we haven't even really sort of touched on, which is, you know, around the jobs and, you know, how many people a year, 2 years down the line will may even still have the privilege to say, yes, they still work within the sector. So it's really a difficult time for those that are furloughed, let alone those who are still, you know, still holding on and still have the jobs. I think just sort of shifting, I mean, you've all raised really important points. I feel like we could have a seminar, another day on these. But just moving forward slightly, and we've touched on some of these. So how do we do that? How do we place the community at the center? So we talked of it around how these movements are galvanizing, and Sepake, you made the really important points. Let's not forget the movements, the organizations that have been doing this work for a long time, for decades, who still continue to do that. And we absolutely, we respect, and we see those people there. And sometimes we need to find ways, I think, of bringing the conversation together more so that things can happen in sort of more profound, more meaningful ways. I wonder, Sarah, if you had any insights on that question around the community, and how do we place the community at the center, at the heart of what we do?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, particularly in light of the current kind of financial challenges and, you know, the sort of, you know, limitation on global movements. I work at the Museum of London. We're developing a new museum that will open, you know, maybe in about 4 years' time. And so I think, you know, I spend most of my days thinking about the balance between the audiences who are missing, the audiences who are underrepresented, and the massive target that we have of just numbers of audiences, the sheer numbers of audiences that need to be attracted for both the business plan to work and for the endeavour to be, you know, of legitimate public value. And, you know, market forces dictate for most museums that, you know, part of the tourism industry. A lot of us curators and so forth like to think that we are scholars and, you know, kind of quasi academics, but essentially we're part of the leisure industry, and that's an industry. And, you know, it doesn't matter what you tell people over a dinner party, you are part of the leisure industry and the tourism industry if you work in a museum. And getting people across that threshold for most medium to large size museums means attracting a very large proportion of tourists. So that gets to the core of kind of your mission. If on the one hand you're saying, actually we want to be representative of our city, as we do at London, that means thinking about the people who are massively missing, really like overwhelmingly missing from all museum audiences in London, particularly people of colour, people who are not rich, people who are living in poverty, etc. So when you balance that up against the temptation to serve a very kind of ready tourist audience who are generally economically buoyant, you know, if you're here as an overseas tourist, you've kind of got disposable income by the very definition. And so the nature of the kind of tourists that are make up the vast majority of tourists to London museums are, of course, European, American, Canadian, and Australian. Those are the big numbers. So what does it mean to put your actual London community at the heart of that vision and that mission? And I suppose that some of the solutions and the answers that we're coming towards at the Museum of London is that there is different weighting of people, just as you think of a kind of, not that some audiences are more important than others exactly, but kinda. Like, I think of the audiences that are first and foremost must be served as super users. And I think of them as such because I think that they should be super empowered. Like, Londoners should be super empowered at the Museum of London because it is their museum. And I suppose the way that we're trying to do that at the Museum of London is by trying to engage 100,000 people in the building of that museum, both through consultation and co-curation and user-generated stories, to make sure that the Londoners are in the DNA of the new Museum of London, because it's a civic institution, not a rarefied gallery or, you know, a sort of something separate from society. And I have this one kind of story that I keep in my mind when I think about super users, is that one day we had a takeover day, you know, the kids in museums where the children take over the museum.
Yeah.
And although there was probably less than 100 children in the museum that day, the children were welcoming people at the front desk, the children were giving the guides of the museum, the children were running the shizzle, you know, they were in charge, and they looked to me like super empowered, super users of the museum on that day. And although there were only 100 of them, and there might have been thousands of people visiting the museum that day, it completely changed the atmosphere of the museum for everybody. It felt like a museum of Londoners for Londoners, and everybody wants a taste of that, a flavour of that. That's actually what I feel tourists probably really want from the Museum of London, is to meet Londoners. And so by super empowering those young people in the museum that day, I felt like it tipped the balance, and that was a really clear definition to me of how you put your local community at the absolute heart of the operation. And if we can do it for one day, you know, it shouldn't be a one-day thing. We need to embed that and do it systematically and strategically and structurally, so that we can kind of make that takeover day essentially the kind of normal modus operandi. That's how I look at it. We haven't got to the end of the journey yet, but kind of there are some thoughts.
Okay, and I think again it's going back to that energy from young people when they're allowed to come in and to do that, but obviously not just as the one-offs as well. You know, we've seen that sometimes, and we've now got the concept of the Friday late, you know, when it's you know, people come in, they come over for the drink, but the takeovers, I mean, I can think of one, the Galdem, I think at the V&A a couple years ago. I mean, I've never seen so many people in the V&A. I wondered, Sepake, how does that look for you in terms of your organisation and this idea of, I suppose, takeovers, but not just a takeover for just one evening and then everybody goes away, or this idea around communities being at the centre, whether they're young or elderly groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that question of, like, you know, I suppose for me, I was just sort of thinking about, I actually see sort of museums and cultural organisations probably more from an education point of view. I think of them less as like leisure, but let's just go with the idea that, you know, education is a leisurely activity for the moment. And I think what I really am passionate about is actually how we kind of can expand the notion of the classroom and think about the city as a place of culture and learning. So when I sort of talk about the classroom, I guess as a space that can be expanded, then you can think about how other institutions are included in that learning, and recognizing that, and I think this is the thing that I think people have a real difficulty with, is saying this collection of items and precious things, they belong to you. You know, that you as a public, you have a kind of right to them. You have a right to access them. And I think somehow that message is still, you know, it's something that just needs to be continually repeated. Because I think I love telling people, yeah, this collection of work and this, you know, this museum, this gallery, it belongs to you. It's yours. And I think when you have that sense that that museums and galleries and space and objects within museums and galleries are publicly owned, then of course there is a different kind of responsibility potentially that we can sort of work from. But I think there's still a lot of work to understand that the spaces within our cities, within our towns, are, can also be seen as public spaces. And that's why I think a lot of the kind of demands that we see in various museums in the US and in the UK, where the museum and the gallery is taken up as a public space in order to create audible demands, is really exciting. It's exhilarating because it's actually recognizing that yes, this space also belongs to you. So I feel as if there's multiple levels of where this conversation can go, but also I just recognize that it's something that has to be continually repeated. It can't just be sort of said once, it has to be said again and again, and in different places and in different forums. I know there's a lot of restrictions now, especially in UK schools, in terms of being able to get kids out of the classroom and get them into the city and into museums and into spaces. But it's so fundamental to have those experiences as early as possible and continually, to really fully understand that our space for learning and education extends way beyond the classroom.
Yeah, thank you, Sepake. And I think absolutely, to try to get that engagement as early as possible, and to sort of think beyond it just being as those kind of one-off interventions. I wondered, Monica, if you can say something around social justice. You touched on it a little bit with some of the activist movements out in the States, but I wondered how, in your view, social justice can be at the part of this. Because if you think the whole Black Lives Matter, the whole movement, that is what we've seen as an example of around social justice, where it's coming from the streets, it's coming from people, the demands are really there. So how can the museum be a part of all of this? And how do you think we could work more better in terms of placing social justice at the heart of things?
Sure. Well, I'm really proud to be a social justice curator. So every exhibit I've ever curated in my career has had social justice at the center, whether that's about Black Lives Matter or climate change or feminism and Me Too, or looking at protecting the pipelines in Native American nations, looking at defunding the police. There's so much that's happening every day. All you have to do is turn on the news and you can see the outcries of the people and what's happening. And I believe, and have always believed, that museums are supposed to be in service to society. So even though the original birthing of museum was coming out of this residue of colonization, looting, all of the taking that has happened from many indigenous cultures throughout the world, museums are finally evolving to the point that is overcoming the exclusions that birthed them, but realizing we are here for the people. So the way to answer your previous question, how to place community at the center, is honoring social justice movements. And the people, the persons, the collectives that are championing that. I think that museums can either be conveners or maybe co-conspirators. So if you allow your space, be that digital or physical or a gallery, I don't want to exclude galleries too, to convene, for people to come together. Here in the States, there have been protests and demonstrations and uprisings nightly, and many museums in major cities are making their lobbies available. Theaters are doing this too, giving out water, offering hand sanitizer, masks, giving people a chance to take respite in the lobbies of museums that are along the protest path. That is centering community. That is what always could have been and should be. And even when the protests died down, I think that there's a space that museums can hold for social justice movements. I also think when we think of other civic institutions, whether that's a hospital or a school or a park or a library, those civic institutions are very beholden to their communities and often judged, and they have metrics they have to meet to make sure that they're putting the communities first. And museums need to evolve to that, so that the same way, if a school district isn't doing well and the teachers and the administrators are reviewed and there's changes and there's shifts, we have to have that same level of rigor and intentionality in our museums. I think that even when this moment or this movement isn't have the fervor that it has now, we have to still feel the urgency in our spirits as curators, as arts and culture and history workers, to make sure that we're honoring what was and what's to come in terms of social justice and beyond.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I think there's that really interesting, just hearing how, you know, you were saying how museums are just opening up, they're using the lobbies, they're using the spaces. And I think that will be interesting to see if museums here will just take some of that on as some food for thought in terms of how we use the spaces, perhaps differently than what we've used to, particularly given that, Sarah, you mentioned the tourists that are not necessarily going to be here because of the pandemic and the, you know, the whole restrictions around that. So there's this real shift on really looking more locally at our audiences and just being more creative. But thank you, panelists. I'm just aware we've got some questions. So if you're all okay, are you happy for me to just fire out some questions and see how we get on?
Can I just be cheeky and say that I've also had a little snoop at them, and I would love to talk about whiteness a little bit. So I can say about whiteness.
Yes.
So you go
that's probably the one I've got now. This is from Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. A question for the panel at large, if there's time, sure. For those of us in museums who have white privilege and who are working towards being better allies, what strategies would you suggest for supporting, and in brackets, not burdening our Black colleagues and colleagues of colour without centering ourselves or taking over the conversation? In working to dismantle existing structures that white privilege and white voices and viewpoints, how do we, white museum employees, avoid inadvertently dropping the burden of emotional and logistical labour onto our Black colleagues? Thank you.
Could I start on that one?
Who wants to take that one? Yeah.
Could I start?
Sure, Sarah, you go for it.
Well, I think I spotted that one. I think that was from Danielle Tom. And Danielle is a great example of an ally because she's a union rep at the Museum of London. And I'd say, being a good union rep as she is and supporting the BAME staff network as she does is a real example to follow. Generally, I want to say that just don't, don't put the labor on the Black staff. So, and I think people actually kind of, if people look within themselves, they know how not to do that. I think one thing is centering whiteness and centering discussions about whiteness. I've been in these sorts of dialogues and debates for kind of a couple of decades now, and the amount of a kind of neurotic, anxious conversations about Blackness sort of end up making Blackness problematic within the museum. It's always like, where are the Black curators? Where are the Black audiences? And then people of colour become like a problem to solve and a furrow in your brow. And I'm sick of that. I'm really sick of that. And what really needs to happen now, I feel, is for whiteness to be examined, for white people to look at whiteness and how whiteness is reproduced so aggressively in the organisations. And that feels to me like, society has got to a point and the conversation is starting to become a little bit more mature about examining whiteness and just talking about white culture. I mean, it's, even to this day, I find that some people are offended by being called white. Even speaking about whiteness and describing whiteness as a cultural norm is part of decolonizing. And I would love for white people to start talking to each other about, about the presence of whiteness and how just like to think about hearts and minds, because we spend so long in museum detox and it's such important work that we do that is internal work. It's emotional conversations about identity. And there are some really amazing, frank, but also very painful exchanges that happen in the Museum Detox Forum about our careers, about our experiences, about blocks that we've experienced, and about the limits of our ambitions, internalized racism, internalized sexism. These are complicated, gut-wrenching conversations to have, and they take a fair amount of bravery, even to be having them in a relatively safe space. And I kind of urge my white colleagues to start having a different kind of conversation with themselves about race that doesn't center a Black experience as a problem to be solved, but somehow starts to look at your own identity in relation to power and think about the way that you design your careers. Like many of us in Museum Detox accept, I think, that there's a kind of tax on our careers, that if you want to be an activist and you want to be a social change agent, then you're not always going to be able to spend your evenings like publishing that article or working towards that accreditation, because actually you've got other shit to do, and you've made a decision to prioritize that other shit, like the going to a Museum Detox meetup or mentoring someone or those other things. There are reasons why, you know, we sacrifice certain things in terms of how we define and design our careers. And, you know, my mum was a union activist, and she always used to say to me, you know, she was at the BBC, she always used to say to me, don't be like me, because I didn't get as far in my career as I should have done because I was so busy unionizing and all of that. Be like the others that I saw, you know, be like those others that I saw who weren't doing that stuff, but they went higher up the ladder. I want you to be like those guys. And the truth is, we can't afford that luxury yet. You know, on the whole, people of colour cannot afford the luxury of publishing things, doing all the pretty CV things that really stand out. And I want white colleagues to think about that a little bit more. What are you doing in your career that you could, like, if you're really committed to social change and justice, what could you actually be sacrificing? Where could you spend in your energies that are slightly less self-serving and slightly more about kind of, you know, correcting the imbalances? And I don't want to be a flagger, because a lot of people are doing good work. I feel like exploring whiteness is high time.
But thank you, Sarah. And I think, yeah, that whole question is something. You just reminded me, there was a TV program on, I think was it Channel 4, that asked school kids. It was the school that talked about racism. It was basically getting groups of blacks and white kids together. They separated and they asked the white children to say, well, what does it mean to be white? What does it? And I remember one just said, well, it's just normal, isn't it? You know, there's nothing, but they couldn't seem to. It was this kind of unease. And I think there is something that about actually just, it's not just around the you know, blackness or to be seen as the problem. There is whiteness too. I mean, Monica, how is this conversation, how is this shaping up for you for over in the States? The idea of whiteness and white allies and people wanting to help, and those real practical steps. I know you mentioned the things like LinkedIn, you know, just giving a recommendation, things like that. But I wondered if there was something more in terms of whiteness you wanted to add.
Sure. I think to echo what Sarah and you have said is that whiteness, unfortunately, is the default for us all. It's the psychological default. It's the color of Band-Aids, it's the color of dolls, it's the way that people have to identify and put a qualifier of what kind of American they are if they're not a white American. White Americans don't say they're white American, they say they're American, whereas African American, Caribbean American, Asian American, and all of that kind of has a qualifier. And so I think it's incumbent of people who are white and who are, you know, engaged in whiteness to decenter themselves and to take up less space, to signal boost and amplify Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color, and do that fervently and consistently and urgently, to do as much reading and learning as they can from all of the plethora of online resources and Google Docs that have been put out there. And I'm happy to share some of those. There's a lot of links to readings and podcasts and movies and books about race and equity and anti-racism, and I think that that's all freely available. But then it's how to operationalize taking what you've learned and putting that into your life so that you can be someone who is kind of reversing the status quo and an agent of change. And again, to me, the way to advocate for BIPOC folks is to put them ahead of yourself, lift them up. I would even dare to go as far as saying if someone who is a white person is due to get a raise, a promotion, some other favoritist thing that comes because of their whiteness, think about how you can graciously pass that opportunity along to someone who has never had it, who's either in your social sphere or in your work sphere. I think that's the kind of radical shift and radical thinking we have to do. We have to literally deny ourselves the favor and give the shine equitably to others who deserve it and who've been there all along.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I'm just aware there are like 40 questions, and there's no way we're going to have time to really do all of them justice, but there was a question that just caught my eye. Anonymous attendee, hello anonymous attendee. This is the question. I think we would love to hire people of colour as curators, but they are difficult to find. Is there a pool of people of colour curators looking for jobs? Question mark. Museum work doesn't pay especially well. Why wouldn't people of colour look for jobs that pay better?
I'd like to jump in on that first.
Please.
I want to firmly assert right now, henceforth and forevermore, people of color are not hard to find. We are here. We have been here. There are groups like Museum Detox, Museum Hue, Women of Color in the Arts, Arts Administrators of Color, all groups all around the world where people are collecting, or I should say where people are gathering and collectives are forming, and those people are just as interested in curatorial jobs as anyone else. And it's incumbent upon you as a hiring manager or a curator with influence to cast a wider net, to search deeper and further than you're normally used to. If you're used to using certain websites, find other ones, look into community colleges and heritage lotteries, places that people who are often at the margins are, and give people that chance. I don't believe that you need a terminal degree to be a curator. I'll say that first and foremost. So everyone who doesn't have a PhD can and still should be eligible at the very least for a fellowship. So it's the ways of decolonizing our thinking, looking beyond where we normally look, and refuting that assumption that they don't exist, because we do exist. I did a session called We're Not Hard to Find at the American Alliance of Museums Conference 3 years in a row, sold out, packed room, and everyone's like, where are the people? And so we went into that.
Oh, nice one. We're not hard to find. I like that. Just going through, I think we're almost out of time now. We're slotted to run through 15 minutes. Can we take one more? Are we nearly towards the end? All right, I've got one. Sorry, Sarah?
Just say a quick thing about hiring to everybody who's watching.
Yes, please. Sorry, I didn't give you guys a chance to answer that. Please do. Yes.
As far as I know, the museum in the Western world that has the best record of hiring people of colour is the Birmingham Museum Trust in the UK, which has the highest proportion of non-white staff of any museum in the UK, and to my knowledge, in the US as well. If you want to know how it's done, take a look at Birmingham Museum Trust. It's really totally feasible. They have managed it. So can you.
Thank you. Sepake, is there anything you wanted to add in that, in terms of this idea that you know, curators are hard to find, there's not enough of them, and why would they want to work in a gallery or museum?
Just, I think it's already been said, but this term of like what, you know, it can be deemed as, or who can be deemed as a curator, I think we need to sort of think a bit more broadly about what are the actual attributes and skills that we want to sort of see in our institutions and our spaces. And I think that there is a lot to be said about that job description, which actually puts a lot of people off, because a lot of people, I also think, kind of maybe look at a job description and think, oh, I don't know if I've got all of those things. But actually, I just feel as if it's what I found anyway, personally, it's about understanding that language, and that almost needs to be completely undone. I mean, I think that you asked at the beginning, you know, what are some of the things that we need to kind of, you know, unravel within our institutions and our museums and spaces. And I think one of them is around language, and how language actually can act, you know, as a barrier, and doesn't really allow for the kind of communication actually that we would like to make, which is to really say, you know, we want this space to be a space which is reflective of our communities, of our culture, you know. And again, I just sort of feel that, yeah, there is a bit of, and I guess partly this is also related, I guess, to whiteness, this question of like, when I was first employed, I think I was, just before this, I'd actually asked the one of the heads of education in the institution that I was going to be working in, you know, I said, why do you think your institution looks so white? So actually reflecting that question back on the institution itself, why do you think your institution looks so white, as opposed to asking, where can I find people of colour to work in my institution? There needs to be an inner reflection into what are the cultures within the institution that need to be unravelled.
And I would add to that, if I may, and what circumstances need to be there for people of colour to thrive when they are in institutions.
Absolutely. And that support, you know, if they're being asked, people being asked to, I don't know, be on boards, getting into the museum, what's the support for them long term? I'm aware of just time, but there was something that just kind of popped out. So I'm just going to quickly fire this one. Which we didn't really speak about. This is around the idea of Black patronage of museums. Is it audacious? This is from Anonymous. Is it audacious for museums to ask Black folks to fund Black projects that museums should have been producing all along? So the idea of Black patronage, what do you guys have to say? What do our panelists have to say on that?
I'm just going to jump in really quickly and just say,
Please.
I welcome it. Because I think that, you know, I've been thinking about sort of diversity in our staffing structures, diversity in the board, you know, diversity in our kind of employment structures. Then we also need to have diversity in our patronage as well. I think it's extremely important. And yeah, I think so that's what I have to say on that.
I think there'd be so many willing to take up. What about you, Sarah? How would the idea of Black patronage, how would that sit within somewhere like the Museum of London, the new site? I mean, we've got people who I'm sure would step up to the plate. Maybe if they saw the idea of representations of themselves and identity. But what do you have to say around Black patronage?
I think Black patronage is extremely important. I'm very nervous of the idea of Black patrons paying for Black projects. I think these are public institutions, and the idea that Black projects should only be funded by Black patrons is, you know, really problematic for obvious reasons. But I think absolutely, and there are people like Caroline Hussey-Bain at the Tate, who is head of development there, and she's done an amazing job. She learned from a tour of the States. She learned a lot about how a lot of different African American trustees and patrons have operated in the gallery system there, and she's brought that learning back to Tate. Also, I think we're actually quite fortunate at the Museum of London to have, by coincidence, an amazing African American, a friend of the museum, who is starting to, change how things are. Been quite a lot of unsavory characters saying unsavory and like unacceptable things to me as a person of colour, and so I've come to slightly dread going to patron events. But this one was a whole different affair. It was mainly a room of people of colour coming to the museum and thinking about what it meant to them and what it meant to them to become patrons or associate with an organisation like that. And it was the first patron event that I really enjoyed.
I'd love to jump in.
I think it's something. Yes, Monica.
So,
go ahead.
In an American context, I've been reading a lot about arts collectors and Black arts collectors, and of course, galleries. There was a great article in the Times about Black galleries and how they're looking, of course, for more representation and equity in the art fairs like Art Basel and other fairs like it. And I am blessed to be connected to a lot of arts collectors. I collect art myself, you know, as a curator. I love art. But I think that while Black arts collectors should and could collect Black art and support Black institutions, I don't think it should be exclusively them. And if we think of the spirit of equity, of taking resources where there are plenty and giving to where there are few, I do think that major funders and white philanthropists have a duty and a moral imperative to support these projects as well, because they have, right? And because these are projects that are worthwhile. And again, they're not relegated to just being for a small ethnic heritage month. Everyone can appreciate the breadth and scope of a Black art show, a Black history show, and on and on. So I think that people who have the resources need to give them across the board, and Black art collectors and Black patrons can support too.
Amen. I think it's something really interesting to sort of explore further, certainly within a UK context. I get over in the States, you don't seem to have a trouble asking people to, you know, to give, and they're willing to give. I think there's something around a cultural thing here. Sometimes we're a bit kind of stiff-lipped about asking, and I'm really looking forward to seeing that change across the arts, across culture, and certainly across museums around that. Now, I do believe we're out of time. I wonder if Judith, Rachel, Emma, anyone else is going to jump on at this moment. There's so much to talk about, isn't there? I feel this could have been a whole day. We could have just flung some music in. I'm feeling some music. Some intervals, we could have had some arts performance. You know what, maybe after this we'll just talk and make it happen. We'll do it for another time. We'll have a lot more time, because these are really important topics that are being raised here. You've all made some incredibly salient points here, and I think sometimes we just need to have that space ourselves to really lean into these conversations. Some of them are not things we can just rush by in 5 minutes or 2-minute quick responses. Sometimes they need time to just kind of settle, and hopefully things like this, where we can have more people in the room, all different perspectives, different insights. So I just want to say on my part, thank you all for your courage, your uniqueness that you all bring to the table with you know, with all of your work and all that you do. You know, a luta continua, we continue, it goes on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.